My daughter-in-law had no idea that when she systematically replaced my heart medications with sugar pills to speed up my decline and positioned herself as my devoted caregiver while secretly planning to inherit my son's trust fund, she was actually targeting Dr. Margaret Maggie Thornfield, the former chief medical officer of the state health department, who had personally overseen medical fraud investigations that sent dozens of healthcare criminals to federal prison, maintained direct relationships with the FBI's healthcare fraud unit and the DEA's prescription monitoring division, and could make her entire... Before we dive into how I systematically documented every pill switch, every forged medical record, and every manipulative conversation that would result in federal charges for attempted murder, healthcare fraud, and elder abuse, let me paint you the picture she saw versus the reality she never suspected. To Jennifer Walsh, my daughter-in-law, I was just Margaret Thornfield, the frail 72-year-old woman with advancing dementia who seemed confused about her medications, who appeared grateful for her caring assistance with daily pill management, who clearly needed her expert guidance to navigate the complex medical requirements of my deteriorating health, and who would obviously leave everything to my beloved son when my carefully accelerated decline finally reached its inevitable conclusion. What Jennifer never discovered was that Margaret Thornfield had spent 43 years climbing from emergency room nurse to chief medical officer of the state health department, personally investigating over 200 cases of medical fraud and elder abuse, coordinating with federal law enforcement agencies during major healthcare crime prosecutions, and maintaining active security clearances and professional relationships with investigators who specialized in exactly the kind of systematic medical manipulation and inheritance fraud that she was about to attempt against someone she assumed was just another vulnerable elderly. The irony was almost breathtaking in its perfection. Here she was, planning to commit systematic healthcare fraud and attempted murder against what she perceived as a helpless elderly woman, while sitting across from someone who had spent 4 decades detecting, investigating, and prosecuting exactly her type of sophisticated medical manipulation in hospital boardrooms, insurance companies, and federal courtrooms. She saw cognitive decline where there was strategic analysis. She interpreted my careful questions about my medications as mental confusion rather than recognizing the systematic evidence gathering that I was conducting about her methods, her timing, and her obvious preparation for comprehensive medical fraud and inheritance theft. My son, David Thornfield, had built Thornfield Construction from a small residential contracting business into a diversified development company worth over $15 million. His marriage to Jennifer Walsh 3 years earlier had initially seemed like a blessing, a young nurse who could help care for his aging mother while building their future together. David's trust fund, established through careful estate planning and investment growth over decades, represented not just financial security but the culmination of a lifetime of strategic planning and professional success that I had helped guide and protect. What Jennifer never suspected was that I hadn't just been David's mother for 35 years. I had been his medical advocate, strategic planning consultant, and the analytical mind behind many of the healthcare and insurance decisions that had protected our family's financial interests during various medical crises and estate planning challenges. David had always been the builder and the public face of our family's business success, but I had been the medical professional who ensured his health insurance strategies were comprehensive, his estate planning was medically sound, and his family's healthcare needs were professionally managed and strategically coordinated. Downfall began with her first assessment of my background and capabilities. Jennifer had clearly researched my personal history and discovered that I was a retired healthcare worker who lived alone in a large house, had substantial assets through careful retirement planning, and had developed what appeared to be early-stage dementia that made me dependent on family assistance for daily living activities and medical management. What her superficial research failed to uncover was that I hadn't retired as a simple healthcare worker or traditional elderly patient, but as the chief medical officer of the state health department, with advanced degrees in healthcare administration and medical investigation, who had already established herself as a nationally recognized expert in healthcare fraud detection and elder abuse prevention. The sophisticated medical manipulation that Jennifer was preparing to execute against my health and estate required her to view me as exactly what she assumed I was, a traditional elderly woman whose apparent cognitive decline and medical vulnerability would make me dependent on her nursing expertise, whose confusion about complex medical regimens would make me grateful for her professional guidance, and whose emotional trust in family would prevent any suspicion about the medical assistance that she claimed was necessary for proper healthcare management and medication compliance. Her fundamental miscalculation was assuming that my careful, trusting demeanor during her visits reflected cognitive limitation rather than professional assessment. When I asked detailed questions about my medications, she interpreted curiosity as confusion. When I requested clarification about dosage changes, she assumed memory problems rather than recognizing systematic documentation of her explanations for later analysis and potential evidence collection. When I expressed gratitude for her medical expertise, she never suspected she was being evaluated by someone whose professional credentials in healthcare investigation exceeded her own nursing qualifications in medication management and patient care. The first incident that revealed her true intentions occurred 6 months after David's wedding, when Jennifer began volunteering to manage my medication schedule that she claimed was becoming too overwhelming for someone with my The timing itself was strategically calculated, early enough after joining our family that her helpful assistance would seem natural and caring, but late enough that she had observed my daily routines, financial habits, and family relationships, enough to identify the most effective approach for systematic medical manipulation and estate positioning. Jennifer's background as a registered nurse at Riverside General Hospital gave her both the medical knowledge and professional credibility necessary to execute sophisticated medication fraud while maintaining plausible cover for her actions. Her nursing credentials provided legitimate access to medical information, pharmaceutical knowledge, and healthcare terminology that would make her assistance seem both appropriate and beneficial to family members who trusted her professional expertise and personal commitment to my welfare. The systematic approach that Jennifer employed for medication switching demonstrated careful planning and execution that had clearly been developed through extensive research into both my medical conditions and the detection methods that might expose her manipulation. Her initial changes were subtle enough to avoid immediate suspicion, while being significant enough to create gradual health deterioration that would justify increased medical intervention and family concern about my ability to live independently. Her method involved systematically replacing my essential cardiac medication. The psychological manipulation techniques that Jennifer employed during her visits included systematic interruption when I asked detailed questions about medication changes, condescending explanations that treated basic medical concepts as beyond my comprehension due to cognitive decline, and strategic time pressure that emphasized urgent medical decisions requiring immediate compliance while discouraging careful analysis or outside medical consultation. Her coordination was sophisticated enough that she maintained detailed documentation of my apparent confusion and medical noncompliance that would support her narrative of progressive dementia requiring increased family intervention and estate planning consideration. Jennifer's role was to project medical authority and establish comprehensive control over my healthcare management. Her systematic emphasis on her nursing credentials, hospital experience, and professional knowledge of elderly care created emotional manipulation that positioned trust in her guidance as family loyalty and medical necessity. Her frequent references to David's concern for my welfare and her apparent dedication to my health disguised systematic medical fraud as compassionate professional service and family devotion. The specific manipulation tactics that Jennifer used included technical medical terminology that made independent healthcare analysis appear impossible while building dependency on her nursing expertise and professional guidance. Her systematic use of complex pharmaceutical explanations, detailed medical schedules, and urgent health concerns created psychological pressure that discouraged careful evaluation while emphasizing immediate compliance requiring professional medical intervention and family oversight. Jennifer's focus was on emotional manipulation and age-based assumptions that exploited traditional expectations about elderly cognitive capabilities and medical decision-making authority. Her systematic emphasis on my apparent memory problems, medication confusion, and need for professional medical guidance reinforced stereotypes about aging while building justification for comprehensive healthcare control and family estate planning discussions. The coordination between Jennifer's medical manipulation and her strategic positioning within our family demonstrated systematic planning and execution that had clearly been developed through extensive observation of family dynamics, financial relationships, and estate planning structures. Her comfortable assumptions about my cognitive limitations, medical dependency, and emotional trust revealed careful study of elder abuse methodologies that had obviously been researched extensively enough to build her confidence in executing medical fraud against what appeared to be an ideal victim with substantial assets and trusting family relationships. The moment I realized the full scope of Jennifer's intended medical fraud was when I discovered that my cardiac medication bottles contained sugar pills, rather than the prescribed medications that were keeping me alive, while Jennifer had been documenting my improved compliance with medication management and expressing concern to David about my increasing confusion about medical instructions. The systematic replacement of life-saving medications with placebos, combined with false documentation of medical improvement, revealed the sophisticated criminal operation that Jennifer had clearly planned to execute against an elderly family member whose apparent vulnerability made her an attractive target for systematic medical manipulation and inheritance positioning. What made Jennifer's scheme particularly audacious was the systematic way she had coordinated the medical fraud with strategic family positioning that would establish her as the primary caregiver and medical advocate during my anticipated health crisis. Her devoted nursing care was actually systematic attempted murder disguised as family loyalty, and her professional medical guidance was comprehensive healthcare fraud designed to transfer estate assets from a trusting elderly woman to an unscrupulous daughter-in-law who specialized in exploiting family relationships and medical vulnerability. The documentation that I had been systematically gathering included detailed photographs of the replaced medications, recorded conversations about medication changes, and comprehensive medical records that demonstrated the systematic nature of Jennifer's pharmaceutical manipulation and false medical reporting. My background in healthcare fraud investigation had taught me exactly what evidence would be required to build a federal case for attempted murder, elder abuse, and systematic medical fraud that could withstand prosecution by federal authorities who specialized in healthcare crime and family exploitation cases. The federal relationships that I maintained through my decades of healthcare administration included direct contacts with FBI healthcare fraud investigators, DEA prescription monitoring specialists, and federal prosecutors who had worked on major elder abuse cases that involved systematic medical manipulation and inheritance fraud. These professional relationships, combined with my security clearances and expert witness credentials, provided immediate access to federal investigation resources that could respond rapidly to documented evidence of systematic healthcare fraud and attempted murder against elderly victims. The systematic nature of Jennifer's medical fraud, combined with her position as a licensed healthcare professional, elevated her crimes from simple family theft to federal healthcare fraud that carried mandatory minimum sentences and professional license revocation that would destroy both her criminal scheme and her entire career in healthcare. Her nursing license, hospital employment, and professional reputation would be permanently destroyed along with her freedom when federal investigators discovered the scope of her systematic medical manipulation and attempted murder. The coordination between her medical fraud and inheritance positioning also created federal charges for elder abuse, systematic financial exploitation, and conspiracy to commit murder for financial gain that would result in decades of federal prison time, rather than the comfortable inheritance that she had been planning to enjoy after my anticipated death from natural causes related to age and cardiac complications. The moment when Jennifer casually mentioned to David that my declining health might require discussion of difficult end-of-life decisions and estate planning considerations was the final confirmation I needed that her systematic medical fraud was coordinated with comprehensive inheritance theft designed to position herself as the primary beneficiary of my death. Her careful documentation of my apparent cognitive decline combined with her systematic medication manipulation revealed the complete criminal enterprise that she had developed to murder an elderly family member for financial gain while maintaining cover as a devoted caregiver providing professional medical assistance during a tragic period of natural health deterioration. Before I reveal how I systematically documented every medication switch, every forged medical report, and every manipulative conversation that would result in federal charges for attempted murder, healthcare fraud, and elder abuse that would send Jennifer Walsh to federal prison for the rest of her natural life while stripping her of every asset she thought she was about to inherit, let me explain exactly how a confused elderly woman with dementia became the person that federal healthcare fraud investigators trusted to build ironclad cases against medical professionals who specialized in exploiting vulnerable elderly The systematic destruction that I was about to orchestrate against Jennifer's criminal enterprise would not just expose her attempted murder and inheritance fraud, it would unravel a sophisticated network of medical manipulation that federal investigators had been tracking across multiple states, multiple victims, and multiple healthcare institutions where licensed medical professionals had. What made Jennifer's situation particularly catastrophic was that her systematic medical fraud against me was being conducted while she maintained active nursing credentials at Riverside General Hospital, where federal investigators had already identified suspicious patterns of medication irregularities, patient death rates, and inheritance outcomes that suggested systematic elder abuse and medical fraud being conducted by licensed healthcare professionals with access to vulnerable patient populations. Her decision to target me for systematic medical manipulation and attempted murder would connect her criminal activity to a federal investigation that had been building evidence against healthcare fraud networks for over 2 years. The federal case that I was about to trigger would not just destroy Jennifer's freedom and career, it would expose systematic healthcare fraud that had been generating millions of dollars in illegal inheritance theft, insurance fraud, and medical equipment scams that had victimized hundreds of elderly patients across the region, while generating substantial profits for corrupt medical professionals who specialized in exploiting their professional credentials and patient access to commit systematic financial crimes against vulnerable elderly populations. My professional background in healthcare fraud investigation had given me unique insight into the systematic methods that criminal medical professionals use to exploit elderly patients, and my federal security clearances provided direct access to ongoing investigations, where law enforcement agencies were actively seeking evidence of exactly the type of systematic medical manipulation that Jennifer was conducting against me. Her attempted murder was not just a personal crime. It was evidence of organized healthcare fraud that federal agencies had been investigating as part of a major criminal conspiracy involving licensed medical professionals across multiple jurisdictions. The scope of federal charges that Jennifer would face included not just attempted murder and elder abuse, but systematic healthcare fraud, insurance fraud, prescription drug violations, professional licensing fraud, conspiracy to commit murder for financial gain, and federal racketeering charges that connected her individual crimes to broader patterns of organized elder abuse and medical fraud that had been operating across multiple states and multiple healthcare institutions. The mandatory minimum sentences for her federal crimes would ensure that she spent the remainder of her life in federal prison, rather than enjoying the comfortable inheritance that she had been systematically planning to steal through my anticipated murder. The evidence that I had been systematically collecting over the previous 6 months included detailed documentation of medication tampering, recorded conversations about medical decisions, comprehensive financial records showing inheritance planning coordination, and systematic proof of Jennifer's deliberate medical fraud that would provide federal prosecutors with the type of ironclad evidence required to secure maximum sentences for healthcare fraud and attempted murder charges against licensed medical professionals who had exploited their credentials to commit systematic crimes against elderly. What Jennifer never suspected was that my apparent cooperation with her medical management was actually strategic evidence gathering that had been coordinated with federal healthcare fraud investigators who had been monitoring suspicious patterns of elder abuse and inheritance fraud in our region. My systematic documentation of her medication tampering, medical record falsification, and inheritance positioning was being conducted according to federal evidence collection protocols that would ensure admissibility in federal court proceedings against organized healthcare fraud conspiracies. The federal agencies that would be involved in Jennifer's prosecution included the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Unit, which specialized in investigating systematic medical fraud by licensed professionals, the DEA's Prescription Monitoring Division, which tracked illegal pharmaceutical activities and medication tampering, the Department of Health and Human Services Office. The timing of Jennifer's attempted murder was particularly unfortunate for her criminal enterprise because federal investigators had recently expanded their investigation of healthcare fraud networks to include systematic inheritance fraud and elder abuse patterns that involved licensed medical professionals targeting wealthy elderly patients for systematic medical manipulation and financial exploitation. Her decision to escalate from medication tampering to systematic attempted murder would trigger immediate federal intervention and comprehensive investigation of her criminal activities. The professional relationships that I maintained with federal healthcare fraud investigators stemmed from my decades of service as Chief Medical Officer for the State Health Department, where I had personally coordinated with federal agencies during major healthcare fraud prosecutions that had resulted in hundreds of criminal convictions and millions of dollars in recovered fraudulent claims. My security clearances and expert witness credentials provided immediate access to federal investigation resources that could respond rapidly to documented evidence of systematic healthcare fraud and attempted murder. The systematic nature of Jennifer's medical fraud had created exactly the type of evidence pattern that federal investigators required to build comprehensive cases against organized healthcare fraud conspiracies. Her detailed documentation of my apparent medical decline, combined with systematic medication tampering and inheritance positioning, provided clear proof of premeditated attempted murder coordinated with financial fraud that would result in federal charges carrying mandatory life sentences without possibility of parole. The federal investigation that Jennifer's crimes would trigger had been developing evidence of systematic elder abuse and healthcare fraud networks for over 2 years, and my case would provide the missing connections that investigators needed to expose comprehensive criminal conspiracies involving multiple medical professionals, multiple healthcare institutions, and systematic patterns of elder abuse and inheritance fraud that had been operating across state lines and generating millions of dollars in illegal profits. The coordination between Jennifer's medical fraud and her strategic positioning within our family had created federal evidence of conspiracy to commit murder for financial gain, which carried federal death penalty eligibility under circumstances involving healthcare fraud by licensed medical professionals. Her systematic documentation of my cognitive decline, combined with medication tampering and inheritance planning, provided clear proof of premeditated murder conspiracy that would result in the most severe federal penalties available for healthcare fraud and elder abuse crimes. The impact of federal prosecution on Jennifer's life would extend far beyond criminal penalties to include complete destruction of her professional credentials, permanent revocation of her nursing license, forfeiture of all assets connected to her criminal enterprise, civil liability for damages to me and other potential victims, and permanent exclusion from any healthcare-related employment or professional activities. Her systematic healthcare fraud would result in complete personal and professional destruction that would eliminate any possibility of future criminal activity or financial recovery. The federal asset forfeiture procedures that would accompany Jennifer's prosecution would seize all property, bank accounts, investments, and personal assets that could be connected to her criminal enterprise, including the house that she and David had purchased with anticipated inheritance money, the luxury car that she had bought in anticipation of my death, and all financial accounts that had been established or expanded in coordination with her systematic medical fraud and attempted murder conspiracy. The civil damages that I would be entitled to recover from Jennifer's criminal enterprise would include compensation for attempted murder, medical fraud, emotional distress, and systematic elder abuse that would result in judgment amounts exceeding any assets that Jennifer possessed or could ever accumulate during her lifetime. The federal civil penalties for healthcare fraud and elder abuse would ensure that Jennifer remained financially destroyed, even if she ever completed her federal prison sentence. The professional consequences for Jennifer's nursing career would include immediate license suspension, comprehensive investigation of all previous patients under her care, potential criminal charges related to other suspicious patient outcomes, and permanent professional reputation destruction that would prevent any future employment in healthcare or related fields. Her systematic medical fraud would trigger comprehensive review of her entire professional history and potential identification of additional victims and criminal activities. The coordination between Jennifer's attempted murder and broader healthcare fraud networks would expose systematic criminal conspiracies that had been operating for years, potentially resulting in federal prosecution of multiple medical professionals, comprehensive investigation of healthcare institutions where systematic elder abuse had been occurring, and recovery of millions of dollars in fraudulent insurance claims and illegal inheritance theft that had victimized hundreds of elderly patients across multiple jurisdictions. The federal investigation that would result from Jennifer's attempted murder would also expose systematic failures in healthcare oversight, patient protection protocols, and professional licensing supervision that had allowed organized healthcare fraud networks to operate with impunity while victimizing vulnerable elderly populations. The comprehensive federal response would result in major changes to healthcare fraud detection, elder abuse prevention, and professional licensing oversight that would prevent future systematic exploitation of elderly patients by corrupt medical professionals. The systematic documentation that I had been conducting included detailed evidence of not just Jennifer's individual crimes, but her connections to broader patterns of healthcare fraud and elder abuse that federal investigators had been tracking across multiple states and multiple healthcare institutions. My evidence would provide the missing connections that federal agencies needed to expose comprehensive criminal conspiracies and recover millions of dollars in fraudulent claims and illegal profits that had been generated through systematic exploitation of elderly patients. The federal charges that Jennifer would face represented the culmination of a 2-year federal investigation into systematic healthcare fraud networks, and her attempted murder would provide the evidence that federal prosecutors needed to secure maximum sentences against all participants in organized elder abuse and medical fraud conspiracies. Her decision to target me for systematic medical manipulation would trigger the complete destruction of criminal networks that had been operating across multiple jurisdictions and victimizing vulnerable elderly populations for years. The moment when I realized that Jennifer's systematic medical fraud was connected to broader criminal networks was when I discovered that her medication tampering methods matched patterns that federal investigators had identified in other cases of systematic elder abuse and healthcare fraud involving licensed medical professionals. Her attempted murder was not an isolated crime, but evidence of organized criminal activity that federal agencies had been investigating as part of major healthcare fraud prosecutions involving systematic exploitation of elderly patients for financial gain. To Jennifer Walsh, my daughter-in-law, I was just Margaret Thornfield, the confused 72-year-old woman who seemed to forget which medications she had already taken, who appeared grateful when Jennifer organized my daily pill containers with professional nursing precision, who clearly struggled to understand the complex medical terminology that Jennifer used when explaining my deteriorating cardiac condition, and who obviously needed constant supervision to prevent the kind of dangerous medication errors that could result from cognitive decline and memory problems that were becoming increasingly evident to everyone. Jennifer's systematic assessment of my apparent vulnerabilities had begun during her first visits to my home on Maple Ridge Drive, where she observed what she interpreted as clear evidence of advancing dementia and medical dependency that would make me an ideal target for systematic healthcare fraud and inheritance manipulation. She saw confusion when I asked questions about medication schedules, interpreting my careful inquiries as memory problems rather than professional analysis. She observed gratitude when I thanked her for organizing my medications, mistaking my polite appreciation for the daily routine that Jennifer established for my medication management created multiple opportunities for her to document my apparent cognitive limitations while systematically replacing my essential cardiac medications with identical-looking placebos that would create serious health deterioration without obvious signs of tampering or deliberate sabotage. Her nursing background provided professional credibility for her observations about my declining mental capacity and increasing medical needs that required family intervention and professional oversight. Jennifer's documentation of my apparent confusion included detailed notes about my inability to remember whether I had taken morning medications, my difficulty understanding complex dosage instructions, and my increasing dependency on written schedules and pill organizers that demonstrated progressive cognitive decline requiring professional medical supervision. Her systematic record-keeping created the appearance of careful, devoted nursing care while actually building evidence for inheritance planning discussions and end-of-life medical decision-making that would position her as the primary advocate for my healthcare needs. The cultural assumptions that Jennifer made about elderly cognitive capacity and medical vulnerability were reinforced by her professional experience as a hospital nurse, where she had observed genuine cases of dementia and age-related decline that created legitimate needs for family assistance and professional medical intervention. Her confidence in her assessment of my condition was strengthened by my apparent cooperation with her medication management suggestions, and my expressed gratitude for her professional guidance during what appeared to be an increasingly difficult period of health deterioration and cognitive confusion. Jennifer's systematic approach to building family concern about my declining capabilities included strategic conversations with David about my medication compliance problems, my increasing forgetfulness about medical appointments, and my apparent confusion during medical discussions that suggested the need for comprehensive family involvement in healthcare decision-making and potential legal arrangements for medical power of attorney and estate planning considerations during what appeared to be progressive cognitive decline. The specific behaviors that Jennifer documented as evidence of my declining mental capacity included my requests for clarification about medication changes, which she interpreted as memory problems rather than careful attention to pharmaceutical details. My questions about side effects and drug interactions, which she viewed as confusion rather than informed medical inquiry, and my systematic note-taking during medical discussions, which she saw as compensation for memory loss rather than professional documentation of potential evidence. Jennifer's professional background as a registered nurse at Riverside General Hospital provided her with extensive experience in elderly patient care, medication management, and family communication about progressive medical conditions that required increasing levels of professional intervention and family support. Her confidence in her assessment of my condition was based on legitimate medical training and professional experience with genuine cases of cognitive decline and medical dependency that created real needs for nursing assistance and family involvement. The psychological profile that Jennifer developed of my personality and family relationships was based on careful observation of my interactions with David, my apparent emotional dependency on family support, and my expressed concerns about becoming a burden to my son during what appeared to be an increasingly difficult period of health decline and cognitive deterioration. Her assessment of my emotional vulnerabilities provided strategic insights for manipulation tactics that would build my dependency on her assistance, while positioning her as an essential caregiver and medical advocate. Jennifer's systematic documentation of my daily routines, medication schedules, and apparent cognitive limitations created comprehensive records that would support her narrative of progressive dementia, requiring increasing levels of family intervention and professional medical supervision. Her detailed notes about my confusion during medication administration. The timing of Jennifer's increased involvement in my healthcare management coincided with what she presented to David as my accelerating cognitive decline that required immediate family intervention to prevent dangerous medication errors, missed medical appointments, and poor healthcare decisions that could result in serious medical complications or emergency hospitalizations. Her nursing expertise provided professional credibility for her recommendations about increased supervision and family coordination of my medical care. Jennifer's assessment of my financial vulnerability was based on her observation of my apparent confusion about insurance procedures, medical billing, and prescription costs that suggested cognitive decline affecting my ability to manage complex financial decisions related to healthcare planning and estate management. Her professional experience with elderly patients had taught her to identify signs of financial vulnerability that could be exploited through systematic manipulation of medical decisions and family relationships. The systematic approach that Jennifer used to build my apparent dependency on her nursing assistance included gradually increasing her involvement in medication management, medical appointment coordination, and family communication about my health status, while documenting my grateful acceptance of her professional guidance and my obvious relief at having expert medical support during what appeared to be an increasingly overwhelming period of health decline and cognitive confusion. Jennifer's documentation of my apparent social isolation and emotional dependency included detailed observations about my limited contact with friends, my apparent reluctance to discuss medical concerns with people outside the family, and my expressed gratitude for her professional support during what she interpreted as a period of increasing vulnerability and medical dependency that made me an ideal target for systematic manipulation and exploitation. The professional terminology that Jennifer used when discussing my condition with David created an atmosphere of medical authority and expert assessment that discouraged questions about her observations and recommendations. Her systematic use of nursing terminology, medical concepts, and healthcare protocols created the impression of thorough professional evaluation and evidence-based recommendations for increasing levels of family intervention and medical supervision. Jennifer's strategic presentation of my apparent cognitive decline to David emphasized the progressive nature of my condition, the increasing safety risks associated with independent medication management, and the urgent need for family intervention to prevent dangerous medical errors or healthcare decisions that could result in serious complications or emergency situations requiring immediate professional medical intervention and potential hospitalization. The specific examples that Jennifer provided to David of my apparent cognitive limitations included detailed descriptions of my confusion about medication schedules, my forgetfulness about medical instructions, and my apparent anxiety about healthcare decisions that suggested increasing mental instability and medical dependency requiring comprehensive family support and professional nursing supervision. Her systematic documentation created compelling evidence of progressive decline that justified immediate intervention. Jennifer's professional experience with elderly dementia patients provided her with detailed knowledge of genuine cognitive decline patterns, behavioral changes, and family dynamics that enabled her to create convincing simulations of dementia symptoms while maintaining plausible explanations for any inconsistencies in my behavior or apparent cognitive capabilities that might suggest deliberate deception or strategic manipulation rather than genuine medical deterioration. The family meetings that Jennifer initiated about my increasing healthcare needs were strategically designed to build consensus about the necessity of comprehensive medical supervision, while positioning Jennifer's documentation of my apparent medical noncompliance included detailed records of my confusion about prescription instructions, my forgetfulness about medication timing, and my apparent resistance to necessary medical interventions that suggested cognitive decline, affecting my ability to make informed healthcare decisions and requiring family involvement in medical management and treatment planning to ensure appropriate care and prevent dangerous complications. The systematic approach that Jennifer used to isolate me from independent medical consultation included strategic scheduling of medical appointments when she could accompany me as my nursing advocate, systematic interruption of my questions during medical discussions to clarify my apparent confusion, and comprehensive documentation of my apparent cognitive limitations that would support her recommendations for increased family involvement in healthcare decision-making and medical management. Jennifer's assessment of my apparent financial naivete, Viskerpuralensarhud's recommendation, was based on her observation of my trusting acceptance of her explanations about medical costs, insurance procedures, and DocuBA, healthcare planning, that suggested cognitive decline, affecting my ability to understand complex financial decisions related to medical care and estate management. Her professional background provided credibility for her recommendations about financial planning and estate considerations related to my apparent declining health and increasing medical needs. The strategic timing of Jennifer's escalation of my apparent medical crisis coincided with important family financial decisions, estate planning discussions, and healthcare policy renewals that would require my signature and informed consent for changes that could significantly affect inheritance planning and financial arrangements. Her systematic documentation of my cognitive decline provided justification for keys, family involvement in these critical financial and legal decisions. Jennifer's systematic manipulation of family perceptions about my declining capabilities included strategic coordination of her observations with David's natural concerns about my aging, his emotional investment in my welfare, and his professional obligations that limited his ability to provide direct supervision of my daily medical care and medication management. Her nursing expertise provided professional validation for his concerns while positioning her as the obvious solution for increasing caregiving needs. The comprehensive documentation that Jennifer maintained about my apparent cognitive decline, medical noncompliance, and increasing dependency created systematic evidence that would support legal proceedings for medical power of attorney, guardianship arrangements, and estate planning modifications that would give David and Jennifer comprehensive authority over my healthcare decisions and financial management during what appeared to be progressive mental deterioration requiring professional intervention. And family protection. What Jennifer Walsh never discovered, despite her systematic surveillance of my daily routines and careful documentation of my apparent cognitive limitations, was that Margaret Thornfield had spent 43 years climbing from emergency room nurse at Chicago General Hospital to chief medical officer of the state health department, personally investigating over 200 cases of medical fraud and elder abuse, coordinating with federal law enforcement agencies during major healthcare crime prosecutions that resulted in hundreds of criminal convictions and millions of dollars in recovered fraudulent claims, and maintaining active security clearances and professional relationships with federal investigators who specialized in exactly the kind of systematic medical manipulation and inheritance fraud that she was attempting against someone she assumed was just another vulnerable elderly victim. My professional journey had begun in 1978 as a young emergency room nurse at Chicago General Hospital, where I quickly distinguished myself through exceptional analytical skills and systematic attention to patterns that other medical professionals overlooked. During my early years in emergency medicine, I had developed expertise in recognizing signs of elder abuse, medical neglect, and systematic healthcare fraud that would later become the foundation for my career in medical investigation and healthcare crime prevention. My natural ability to detect inconsistencies in medical records, patient testimonies, and family dynamics had led to several major discoveries of systematic abuse that resulted in criminal prosecutions and significant changes in hospital oversight procedures. The transition from bedside nursing to administrative healthcare management had occurred during the late 1980s, when my systematic documentation of medication irregularities and suspicious patient outcomes had attracted the attention of state health department investigators who were developing new approaches to healthcare fraud detection and elder abuse prevention. My detailed analysis of prescription patterns, patient death rates, and family inheritance outcomes had provided crucial evidence for federal prosecutions of organized healthcare fraud networks that had been operating across multiple states and generating millions of dollars in illegal profits through systematic exploitation of elderly patients. My educational background included a master's degree in healthcare administration from Northwestern University, advanced certification in medical investigation and healthcare fraud detection from the FBI National Academy, and specialized training in elder abuse prevention and prosecution from the Department of Justice. These credentials had provided me with comprehensive knowledge of federal healthcare fraud statutes, evidence collection procedures, and prosecution strategies that enabled effective coordination with federal law enforcement agencies during major healthcare crime investigations involving systematic exploitation of vulnerable patient populations. The scope of my professional responsibilities as Chief Medical Officer had included oversight of healthcare fraud investigations across the entire state health system, coordination with federal agencies during multi-jurisdictional healthcare crime prosecutions, development of new detection protocols for systematic elder abuse and medical fraud, and training of healthcare professionals and law enforcement personnel in recognition and prevention of systematic healthcare crimes. My position had required active security clearances and regular coordination with federal investigators, prosecutors, and healthcare fraud specialists who maintained ongoing relationships that continued beyond my retirement. The specific cases that I had personally investigated during my career included systematic medication tampering by licensed nurses, targeting elderly patients for inheritance fraud, organized prescription drug diversion schemes involving multiple healthcare institutions, comprehensive insurance fraud operations that generated millions in illegal claims through fabricated medical treatments, and coordinated elder abuse networks that used medical manipulation to control and exploit vulnerable elderly patients for financial gain. These investigations had provided me with detailed knowledge of criminal methodologies, evidence patterns, and prosecution strategies that enabled immediate recognition of Jennifer's systematic healthcare fraud. My expertise in federal healthcare fraud prosecution had included personal testimony in over 50 federal court cases involving systematic medical crimes, coordination with FBI healthcare fraud units during major multi-state investigations, development of evidence collection protocols that ensured admissibility in federal court proceedings, and training of federal prosecutors in medical evidence analysis and healthcare fraud detection methodologies. These professional relationships had created permanent connections with federal investigators and prosecutors who specialized in exactly the type of systematic healthcare fraud that Jennifer was conducting. The federal security clearances that I maintained throughout my career had provided access to classified information about organized healthcare fraud networks, systematic elder abuse operations, and coordinated criminal enterprises that exploited healthcare systems for financial gain. These clearances had required comprehensive background investigations, regular security updates, and ongoing coordination with federal agencies that monitored healthcare crimes and maintained databases of criminal patterns, methodologies, and network connections that could identify systematic healthcare fraud operations across multiple jurisdictions. The professional recognition that I had received for my work in healthcare fraud prevention included the Federal Bureau of Investigation Director's Award for Distinguished Service in Healthcare Fraud Investigation, the Department of Health and Human Services Inspector General's Award for Excellence in Elder Abuse Prevention, and the National Association of Healthcare Fraud Investigators Lifetime Achievement Award for contributions to systematic healthcare crime detection and prevention. These awards had established my reputation as a national. The consulting work that I had continued after retirement included coordination with federal agencies on major healthcare fraud cases, expert witness testimony in federal court proceedings involving systematic medical crimes, development of new detection protocols for organized healthcare fraud networks, and training programs for healthcare professionals and law enforcement personnel in recognition and prevention of systematic elder abuse and medical manipulation. These ongoing professional activities had maintained my active relationships with federal investigators and prosecutors. The specific federal agencies that I had worked with during my career included the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Healthcare Fraud Unit, which investigated systematic medical crimes involving licensed healthcare professionals; the Drug Enforcement Administration's Prescription Monitoring Division, which tracked illegal pharmaceutical activities and medication tampering; the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General, which investigated Medicare and Medicaid fraud involving systematic elder abuse; and the Department of Justice's Elder Justice Initiative, which coordinated federal prosecution of systematic crimes against. The database systems that I had access to through my federal relationships included the Healthcare Fraud Prevention Partnership, which tracked patterns of systematic medical fraud across multiple jurisdictions; the Prescription Drug Monitoring Program, which identified illegal pharmaceutical activities and medication tampering; the Elder Abuse Prevention Network, which coordinated information about systematic crimes against elderly victims; and the National Healthcare Fraud Database, which maintained comprehensive records of healthcare crimes, criminal methodologies, and prosecution outcomes. The training programs that I had developed for healthcare fraud detection included systematic recognition of medication tampering, identification of coordinated inheritance fraud schemes, analysis of suspicious patient death patterns, and coordination with federal agencies during healthcare crime investigations. These programs had been implemented across multiple states and had resulted in significant increases in healthcare fraud detection and successful prosecution of systematic medical crimes involving elder abuse and inheritance fraud. The research publications that I had authored during my career included comprehensive analysis of systematic healthcare fraud methodologies, development of new detection protocols for organized medical crimes, statistical analysis of elder abuse patterns in healthcare settings, and coordination strategies for federal prosecution of systematic healthcare fraud networks. These publications had established me as a recognized expert in healthcare fraud investigation and had been cited in federal court proceedings and congressional testimony about healthcare crime prevention. The professional associations that I maintained included membership in the National Association of Healthcare Fraud Investigators, the International Association of Financial Crimes Investigators, the National Elder Law Foundation, and the American Association of Healthcare Administrative Management. These associations had provided ongoing access to current information about healthcare fraud trends, new criminal methodologies, and developing investigation techniques that enabled recognition of emerging threats and systematic criminal enterprises. The continuing education requirements that I maintained for my professional certifications included the expert witness qualifications that I maintained included federal court certification in healthcare fraud analysis, specialized knowledge of medical crime investigation procedures, comprehensive understanding of federal healthcare fraud statutes and prosecution requirements, and extensive experience in systematic elder abuse and inheritance fraud cases. These qualifications had enabled regular testimony in federal court proceedings and coordination with federal prosecutors during major healthcare crime cases. The professional network that I had developed during my career included federal investigators, prosecutors, healthcare fraud specialists, elder abuse prevention experts, and medical professionals who maintained ongoing coordination in healthcare crime prevention and prosecution. These relationships had created permanent access to federal investigation resources and prosecution support that could respond immediately to documented evidence of systematic healthcare fraud and elder abuse. The systematic approach that I had developed for healthcare fraud investigation included comprehensive documentation of criminal methodologies, detailed analysis of evidence patterns, coordination with federal agencies for prosecution support, and development of ironclad cases that could withstand federal court proceedings against organized healthcare fraud networks. This approach had resulted in successful prosecution of hundreds of healthcare criminals and recovery of millions of dollars in fraudulent claims and illegal profits. The recognition that Jennifer's systematic medical manipulation represented organized healthcare fraud had triggered immediate activation of federal investigation protocols that I had developed during my career. Her medication tampering, medical record falsification, and inheritance fraud coordination matched patterns that federal investigators had identified in other cases of systematic elder abuse and healthcare fraud, involving licensed medical professionals targeting wealthy elderly patients for financial exploitation. The federal case development that Jennifer's crimes would trigger represented the culmination of investigation methodologies that I had spent decades developing and refining through successful prosecution of organized healthcare fraud networks. Her attempted murder would provide the evidence that federal prosecutors needed to secure maximum sentences against systematic healthcare criminals and expose broader patterns of elder abuse and medical fraud that had been operating across multiple jurisdictions. The comprehensive destruction that awaited Jennifer's criminal enterprise represented the application of federal prosecution strategies that I had personally developed and implemented against organized healthcare fraud networks during my career. Her systematic medical manipulation had created exactly the type of evidence pattern that federal investigators required to build comprehensive cases against coordinated criminal enterprises involving systematic exploitation of elderly patients for financial gain. The moment when I realized that Jennifer's systematic healthcare fraud matched patterns from major federal cases that I had personally investigated was when I discovered that her medication tampering methodologies, documentation techniques, and inheritance coordination strategies were identical to organized criminal enterprises that had been successfully prosecuted through comprehensive federal investigations, resulting in life sentences for systematic elder abuse and attempted murder of vulnerable elderly patients. The irony was so perfect, so absolutely breathtaking in its cosmic justice, that if I had written it as fiction, publishers would have rejected it as too unbelievable to be credible. Here was Jennifer Walsh, a registered nurse at Riverside General Hospital, systematically planning to commit healthcare fraud, medication tampering, and attempted murder against what she perceived as a helpless elderly woman, while sitting across from Dr. Margaret Thornfield, the architect of the very federal investigation protocols that would destroy her life, the designer of the evidence collection methodologies that would ensure her conviction, and the person whose professional relationships with federal healthcare fraud investigators would guarantee that her systematic Jennifer was attempting to exploit someone whose entire professional career had been built on detecting, investigating, and prosecuting exactly her type of sophisticated medical manipulation. She was conducting systematic healthcare fraud against the person who had personally trained federal investigators in recognizing the precise patterns of medication tampering, medical record falsification, and inheritance fraud that she was employing. She was committing elder abuse against the individual who had developed the comprehensive prosecution strategies that federal agencies use to secure life sentences for healthcare professionals who exploited their medical credentials to commit systematic crimes against vulnerable elderly patients. The beautiful precision of this ironic positioning extended beyond simple coincidence to represent what could only be described as perfect criminal stupidity. Jennifer had spent months carefully researching my apparent vulnerabilities, documenting my supposed cognitive decline, and planning systematic medical fraud that would result in my death and her financial enrichment, while never suspecting that she was targeting the one person in the entire region whose professional background, federal connections, and specialized expertise would guarantee not just her detection and prosecution, but the complete destruction of her life, career, and any possibility of ever recovering from the catastrophic consequences of her criminal enterprise. The systematic methodology that Jennifer was using to commit healthcare fraud against me was identical to the criminal patterns that I had spent decades studying, documenting, and prosecuting through federal court proceedings. Her medication tampering techniques matched case studies that I had personally developed for federal investigator training programs. Her documentation methods for my apparent cognitive decline followed patterns that I had identified in organized elder abuse networks. Her coordination of medical fraud with inheritance planning replicated criminal enterprises that I had successfully prosecuted through comprehensive federal investigations, resulting in life sentences for systematic healthcare crimes. Jennifer's professional confidence in her ability to commit undetected healthcare fraud was based on her experience as a hospital nurse, her knowledge of medication management, and her assumption that elderly patients represented easy targets for systematic exploitation. What she never realized was that her target was the person who had created the very detection protocols that federal agencies used to identify systematic healthcare fraud by licensed medical professionals. Her criminal methodology was being conducted against someone who had literally written the handbook that federal investigators used to prosecute organized medical crimes involving elder abuse and inheritance fraud. The federal investigation protocols that Jennifer's crimes would trigger had been personally developed by me during my career as Chief Medical Officer for the State Health Department. The evidence collection procedures that would ensure her conviction had been designed through my coordination with federal prosecutors during major healthcare fraud cases. The systematic analysis of her criminal patterns would be conducted using methodologies that I had created specifically for prosecution of organized healthcare fraud networks involving licensed medical professionals who exploited their credentials to commit systematic crimes against elderly patients. The specific federal agencies that would investigate Jennifer's crimes maintained ongoing professional relationships with me that dated back decades of successful collaboration in healthcare fraud prosecution. The FBI Healthcare Fraud Unit investigators who would build her case had been trained using protocols that I had developed. The federal prosecutors who would secure her conviction had worked directly with me on similar cases involving systematic medical crimes and elder abuse. The comprehensive destruction of her criminal enterprise would be accomplished using strategies that I had personally designed and implemented against organized healthcare fraud networks. Jennifer's systematic approach to committing healthcare fraud against me demonstrated every single criminal methodology that federal investigators had identified as characteristic of organized medical crimes involving elder abuse and inheritance fraud. Her medication tampering followed patterns that I had documented in federal case studies. Her medical record falsification matched techniques that I had identified in comprehensive healthcare fraud investigations. Her coordination of systematic medical crimes with inheritance planning replicated criminal enterprises that I had successfully prosecuted through federal court proceedings, resulting in life sentences and asset forfeiture. The timing of Jennifer's escalation from systematic medication tampering to comprehensive attempted murder coincided perfectly with federal investigation priorities that I had personally helped establish during my career in healthcare fraud prevention. Federal agencies were actively seeking evidence of organized healthcare fraud networks involving licensed medical professionals, and Jennifer's crimes would provide exactly the type of systematic evidence that prosecutors needed to secure maximum sentences against coordinated criminal enterprises involving elder abuse and inheritance fraud. The professional credentials that Jennifer relied upon to provide cover for her systematic healthcare fraud were exactly the qualifications that made her crimes subject to the most severe federal penalties available for healthcare fraud prosecution. Licensed medical professionals who exploited their credentials to commit systematic crimes against elderly patients faced mandatory minimum sentences, permanent professional license revocation, and asset forfeiture procedures that would ensure complete personal and financial destruction. Her nursing license, which she assumed provided protection and credibility for her criminal activities, would instead guarantee maximum federal prosecution and life imprisonment. The systematic documentation that Jennifer was maintaining about my apparent cognitive decline and medical dependency was creating exactly the type of evidence pattern that federal investigators required to prove premeditated healthcare fraud and attempted murder. Her detailed records of my supposed confusion and medical non-compliance would provide federal prosecutors with ironclad proof of systematic criminal planning and coordination that would result in federal charges carrying mandatory life sentences without possibility of parole. Jennifer's assumption that elderly patients represented ideal targets for systematic healthcare fraud was based on cultural stereotypes and professional arrogance that had been the downfall of hundreds of healthcare criminals during my career in federal investigation and prosecution. Her confidence in exploiting what she perceived as cognitive vulnerability was identical to the criminal psychology that I had studied and documented in comprehensive analysis of organized elder abuse networks. Her systematic approach to medical manipulation matched patterns that I had identified in federal training programs for healthcare fraud detection and prosecution. The federal database systems that would be used to investigate Jennifer's crimes included comprehensive records of healthcare fraud patterns, criminal methodologies, and prosecution outcomes that I had personally helped develop and maintain during my career in federal coordination and prosecution support. Her systematic medical crimes would be analyzed using detection protocols that I had created specifically for identification of organized healthcare fraud involving licensed medical professionals targeting elderly patients for financial exploitation. The expert witness testimony that would ensure Jennifer's conviction would be provided by federal investigators and healthcare fraud specialists, who had worked directly with me during major prosecution cases involving systematic medical crimes and elder abuse. My professional relationships with federal experts would guarantee comprehensive testimony about criminal patterns, evidence analysis, and prosecution strategies that would secure maximum sentences for Jennifer's systematic healthcare fraud and attempted murder. Jennifer's coordination of systematic medical fraud with inheritance planning demonstrated exactly the type of criminal sophistication that federal agencies had identified as characteristic of organized elder abuse networks, involving multiple perpetrators and systematic financial exploitation. Her crimes would trigger comprehensive federal investigation of potential criminal networks, additional victims, and coordinated criminal enterprises that could result in prosecution of multiple individuals and recovery of millions of dollars in fraudulent claims and illegal profits. The federal asset forfeiture procedures that would accompany Jennifer's prosecution had been personally coordinated by me during my career in healthcare fraud investigation and prevention. The comprehensive seizure of all property, financial accounts, and personal assets connected to her criminal enterprise would be conducted using protocols that I had helped develop for maximum recovery of criminal profits and compensation for elderly victims of systematic healthcare fraud and elder abuse. The civil damages that would be recovered from Jennifer's criminal enterprise would be calculated using methodologies that I had developed during my career in healthcare fraud prosecution and victim compensation. The comprehensive financial destruction that would result from federal civil penalties, criminal asset forfeiture, and victim compensation requirements would ensure that Jennifer remained permanently impoverished even if she ever completed her federal prison sentence. The professional consequences for Jennifer's nursing career would be determined using protocols that I had personally developed for healthcare fraud prevention and professional licensing oversight. The permanent revocation of her nursing credentials, comprehensive investigation of all previous patients under her care, and potential identification of additional criminal activities would be conducted using systematic review procedures that I had created specifically for healthcare fraud investigation and prevention. The federal prosecution strategies that would be employed against Jennifer's criminal enterprise had been personally developed by me through decades of successful coordination with federal agencies in healthcare fraud investigation and prosecution. The comprehensive case development, evidence analysis, and prosecution coordination that would ensure her conviction represented the culmination of investigation methodologies that I had spent my entire career developing and refining through successful prosecution of organized healthcare fraud networks. The media coverage that would accompany Jennifer's federal prosecution would follow patterns that I had observed during major healthcare fraud cases involving systematic elder abuse and medical crimes by licensed professionals. The comprehensive destruction of her personal and professional reputation would be amplified by federal prosecution procedures that ensured maximum public awareness of healthcare fraud crimes and their consequences for criminal medical professionals. The educational impact of Jennifer's case would extend beyond individual prosecution to provide training opportunities for healthcare professionals, law enforcement personnel, and elder abuse prevention specialists, who would study her criminal methodology and prosecution as an example of comprehensive federal response to systematic healthcare fraud and elder abuse. Her crimes would become case study material for federal training programs that I had personally developed for healthcare fraud detection and prevention. The systematic analysis of Jennifer's criminal enterprise would be conducted using federal investigation protocols that I had created specifically for prosecution of organized healthcare fraud networks involving licensed medical professionals. Her attempted murder would provide federal agencies with exactly the type of comprehensive evidence required to secure maximum sentences against systematic healthcare criminals and expose broader patterns of elder abuse and medical fraud operating across multiple jurisdictions. The moment when I realized that Jennifer had unknowingly positioned herself for the most complete professional and personal destruction possible under federal healthcare fraud statutes was when I discovered that her systematic medical crimes matched every single pattern that I had identified as characteristic of organized criminal enterprises deserving maximum federal prosecution and life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The foundation that Jennifer Walsh was systematically attempting to destroy through her elaborate healthcare fraud and attempted murder scheme represented 47 years of careful planning, strategic investment, and professional dedication that had transformed the Thornfield family from modest beginnings into one of the most respected and financially secure families in the region. The estate that she assumed would become her inheritance through my anticipated death was not just a collection of assets, but the culmination of decades of sacrifice, professional achievement, and systematic wealth building that had been carefully coordinated between my career in healthcare administration and my late husband Robert Thornfield's success in engineering and construction management. My marriage to Robert Thornfield in 1976 had created a partnership that extended far beyond personal relationship to encompass comprehensive financial planning, career coordination, and systematic wealth accumulation that had been guided by our shared commitment to building generational security for our family. Robert's engineering expertise and my healthcare administration background had provided complementary skills that enabled strategic investment decisions, professional networking opportunities, and systematic business development that had generated substantial wealth through careful planning and disciplined execution over nearly 5 decades of marriage and partnership. The Thornfield family estate that Jennifer was targeting for systematic theft included the primary residence on Maple Ridge Drive, a 4,200-square-foot custom home on 12 acres of professionally landscaped property that had been designed and built by Robert's construction company using premium materials and advanced engineering techniques that had created a showcase property worth over $2.8 million. The house had been specifically designed to accommodate aging in place, with accessible bathrooms, elevator access to the second floor, and comprehensive medical equipment capabilities that had enabled me to maintain independent living despite the physical challenges associated with advanced age. The financial portfolio that represented the core of our family wealth included diversified investments in real estate, municipal bonds, blue-chip stocks, and professionally managed retirement accounts that had been systematically accumulated through careful saving, strategic investment, and systematic wealth building over decades of dual professional careers. The total value of our coordinated financial assets exceeded $8.5 million, with additional properties, business interests, and collectibles that brought our total estate value to over $12 million in carefully managed and strategically positioned wealth. The real estate holdings that Jennifer assumed would become part of her inheritance included 3 rental properties in prime locations that generated substantial monthly income through professional property management and strategic tenant selection. These properties, worth a combined $3.2 million, had been acquired through systematic investment and renovation over 25 years of careful market analysis and strategic purchasing decisions that had created a reliable income stream and substantial appreciation in property values. The business interests that Robert had developed during his career in construction and engineering had been systematically transferred to our son David through careful succession planning that ensured continued family control and professional management. The educational investments that we had made in David's professional development included private schooling, university education at prestigious institutions, advanced degree programs, and professional training that had enabled him to successfully manage and expand the family business while building his own professional reputation and financial security. The total investment in David's education and professional development had exceeded $400,000, representing our commitment to ensuring his success and ability to continue building family wealth and professional reputation. The charitable commitments that had been central to our family values included systematic donations to healthcare research, educational institutions, and community development organizations that had totaled over $800,000 during our lifetime of professional success and financial prosperity. Our charitable giving had been coordinated with tax planning strategies that maximize the impact of our donations while providing appropriate tax benefits and supporting causes that aligned with our professional backgrounds and personal values. The insurance planning that had protected our family's financial security included comprehensive life insurance policies, disability coverage, long-term care insurance, and professional liability protection that had been systematically coordinated to ensure complete financial protection against unexpected circumstances, medical emergencies, and potential professional liabilities associated with our careers in healthcare administration and construction management. The estate planning that had been carefully coordinated through expert legal advice included comprehensive wills, trust arrangements, power of attorney documents, and healthcare directives that ensured systematic transfer of wealth according to our wishes, while minimizing tax consequences and protecting family interests against potential challenges or manipulation by individuals seeking to exploit family relationships for financial gain. The professional relationships that had supported our systematic wealth building included financial advisors, estate planning attorneys, tax specialists, and business consultants who had provided expert guidance in investment strategy, legal planning, and systematic wealth accumulation over decades of professional success and financial growth. These relationships had ensured that our financial decisions were based on expert advice and comprehensive analysis rather than speculation or financial inexperience. The family traditions that had been established through our systematic approach to wealth building included annual financial planning meetings, regular estate planning updates, systematic charitable giving, and comprehensive education about financial responsibility and professional ethics that had prepared David to successfully manage family wealth and continue building financial security for future generations. The systematic documentation that had been maintained throughout our wealth-building process included comprehensive financial records, professional correspondence, investment analysis, and estate planning documentation that provided complete transparency and systematic oversight of all financial decisions and wealth accumulation activities. This documentation had been essential for tax planning, estate administration, and systematic transfer of financial knowledge and management expertise. The property management that had been essential to our real estate investment success included systematic maintenance, professional tenant management, strategic renovation, and careful market analysis that had ensured maximum return on investment while maintaining property values and rental income stability. The total annual income from our real estate holdings exceeded $280,000. Providing substantial cash flow for living expenses and continued investment opportunities. The business succession planning that had been carefully coordinated for Thornfield Construction Company included systematic transfer of ownership, professional management training, comprehensive documentation of business operations, and strategic planning for continued growth and profitability under David's leadership. The transition had been designed to ensure business continuity while protecting family interests and maintaining the professional reputation that had been built through decades of excellent work and ethical business practices. The retirement planning that had enabled our financial security during our later years included systematic saving through professional retirement accounts, strategic investment in income-producing assets. The security measures that had been implemented to protect our family wealth included professional financial management, legal oversight of all major transactions, systematic monitoring of investment performance, and comprehensive fraud prevention protocols that had been designed to prevent unauthorized access to financial accounts and protect against systematic theft or financial manipulation by individuals seeking to exploit family relationships or apparent vulnerabilities. The healthcare planning that had been central to our retirement security included comprehensive medical insurance, long-term care coverage, systematic coordination with healthcare providers, and financial planning for potential medical expenses associated with aging and chronic health conditions. The total annual cost of our healthcare planning exceeded $45,000, representing our commitment to maintaining health and independence while protecting family wealth against catastrophic medical expenses. The family legacy that Jennifer was systematically attempting to steal through her elaborate healthcare fraud and attempted murder scheme represented not just financial wealth, but decades of professional achievement, ethical business practices, systematic charitable giving, and family values that had been carefully cultivated and protected through comprehensive planning and disciplined execution over nearly 5 decades of marriage and professional partnership. The emotional investment that Robert and I had made in building family security and professional reputation extended far beyond financial considerations to encompass systematic relationship building, community involvement, professional mentorship, and charitable commitment that had created lasting impact and positive legacy that would continue benefiting future generations and community organizations long after our deaths. The systematic approach that Jennifer was using to destroy our family legacy through healthcare fraud and attempted murder represented not just criminal behavior, but comprehensive attack on decades of ethical achievement, professional success, and systematic wealth building that had been accomplished through legitimate means and careful planning rather than criminal activity or exploitation of vulnerable individuals. The moment when I realized that Jennifer's systematic healthcare fraud represented an existential threat to everything that Robert and I had built during our lifetime of professional achievement and family dedication was when I discovered that her attempted murder was coordinated with comprehensive inheritance theft that would transfer our entire family legacy to someone who had contributed nothing to its creation while systematically destroying the ethical foundation and charitable commitments that had been central to our family values and professional reputation. What Jennifer Walsh never realized, despite her systematic surveillance of my family relationships and careful documentation of my apparent dependency on David's assistance, was that I wasn't just David Thornfield's aging mother who required increasing levels of family support and medical supervision. I was his unofficial business consultant, strategic planning advisor, and the analytical mind behind many of the financial decisions that had transformed Thornfield Construction from a small residential contracting company into a major regional development enterprise worth over $15 million. The professional relationship that David and I had maintained throughout his career development had been carefully cultivated to ensure systematic transfer of business knowledge, strategic planning expertise, and professional networking connections that had been essential to his success in expanding the family business beyond traditional construction into comprehensive development, property management, and municipal contracting that required sophisticated analysis of market conditions, regulatory requirements, and long-term strategic positioning in competitive business environments. Jennifer's assumption that my role in David's life was limited to traditional elderly parent dependency had prevented her from discovering that I maintained active involvement in major business decisions, strategic planning meetings, and financial analysis that were central to Thornfield Construction's continued growth and profitability. My background in healthcare administration and federal regulatory coordination had provided unique expertise in contract negotiation, regulatory compliance, and systematic risk management that had been invaluable for David's expansion into government contracting and institutional development projects. The systematic business consultation that I provided to David included detailed analysis of potential contracts, comprehensive review of regulatory requirements, strategic planning for business expansion, and coordination with professional advisors about financial planning, legal compliance, and systematic risk management. My decades of experience in healthcare administration had provided expertise in complex regulatory environments, federal compliance requirements, and systematic coordination with government agencies that had been directly applicable to David's expansion into municipal contracting and institutional development projects. The financial advisory relationship that had been central to Thornfield Construction's success included my ongoing analysis of investment opportunities, systematic review of business expenses and revenue optimization, comprehensive evaluation of expansion strategies, and coordination with professional financial planners about business growth, tax planning, and systematic wealth accumulation through strategic business development and careful financial management. Jennifer's documentation of my apparent confusion about business matters had completely misinterpreted my careful questioning about Thornfield Construction's operations as cognitive decline, rather than recognizing systematic analysis of business performance, market conditions, and strategic planning requirements that were central to my ongoing advisory role in David's professional success and business expansion. The professional networking connections that I maintained through my career in healthcare administration had provided David with access to government officials, regulatory specialists, and institutional decision-makers who had been essential for securing major contracts, navigating complex regulatory requirements, and establishing strategic partnerships that had enabled Thornfield Construction's expansion beyond traditional residential construction into comprehensive development and municipal contracting. The strategic planning sessions that David and I conducted regularly included comprehensive analysis of market trends, systematic evaluation of business expansion opportunities, detailed review of competitive positioning, and coordination of long-term strategic planning with professional advisors about business development, financial planning, and systematic growth strategies that would ensure continued success and family wealth accumulation. Jennifer's systematic surveillance of my daily activities had failed to detect the extensive business correspondence, strategic planning documentation, and professional coordination that I maintained through secure digital platforms, encrypted communication systems, and systematic coordination with David's business advisors about ongoing projects, strategic planning requirements, and systematic business development that were central to Thornfield Construction's continued success. The regulatory expertise that I provided to David's business operations included comprehensive knowledge of federal compliance requirements, systematic understanding of healthcare-related regulations that applied to institutional construction projects, detailed analysis of municipal contracting requirements, and coordination with regulatory specialists about complex compliance issues that were essential for securing and completing major development projects. The contract analysis that had been central to Thornfield Construction's success in government and institutional contracting included my systematic review of regulatory requirements, comprehensive evaluation of compliance obligations, detailed analysis of financial terms and risk allocation, and coordination with legal advisors about contract negotiation strategies that had enabled David to secure profitable contracts while minimizing systematic risks and regulatory exposure. Jennifer's assumption that my interest in David's business activities represented cognitive confusion rather than professional expertise had prevented her from recognizing that my questions about business operations, financial performance, and strategic planning were based on decades of experience in complex organizational management, federal regulatory coordination, and systematic strategic planning that had been directly applicable to business development and expansion. The professional education that I had provided to David throughout his career development included systematic training in regulatory compliance, comprehensive instruction in strategic planning methodologies, detailed education about financial analysis and risk management, and ongoing mentorship in professional networking and business relationship development that had been essential for his transition from traditional construction contractor to comprehensive development and municipal contracting specialist. And the succession planning that had been carefully coordinated between David and me included systematic transfer of business knowledge, comprehensive documentation of strategic planning methodologies, detailed preservation of professional networking relationships, and ongoing coordination about long-term business development strategies that would ensure continued success and systematic wealth accumulation beyond my direct involvement in business advisory activities. Jennifer's systematic documentation of my apparent memory problems had completely misinterpreted my detailed note-taking during business discussions as cognitive compensation rather than recognizing professional documentation of strategic planning sessions, systematic record-keeping of business coordination activities, and comprehensive preservation of business development information that was central to ongoing advisory activities and succession planning coordination. The investment coordination that had been essential to our family's wealth accumulation included my ongoing analysis of business investment opportunities, systematic evaluation of real estate development potential, comprehensive review of portfolio diversification strategies, and coordination with professional investment advisors about systematic wealth building through strategic business development and careful financial planning. The professional relationships that I maintained with government officials, regulatory specialists, and institutional decision-makers had been systematically leveraged to support David's business expansion through strategic networking, comprehensive coordination of professional introductions, and systematic facilitation of business development opportunities that had been essential for securing major contracts and establishing strategic partnerships. Jennifer's surveillance of my family interactions had failed to detect the sophisticated business communication, strategic planning coordination, and professional advisory activities that were conducted through secure platforms, encrypted systems, and systematic coordination with David's business advisors about ongoing projects and strategic development that were central to Thornfield Construction's continued success and family wealth accumulation. The municipal contracting expertise that I had developed through my healthcare administration career had been directly applicable to David's expansion into government contracting through my comprehensive knowledge of regulatory compliance, systematic understanding of federal procurement requirements, and professional relationships with government officials who had been essential for securing and completing major municipal development projects. The institutional development coordination that had been central to Thornfield Construction's expansion included my systematic analysis of healthcare facility requirements, comprehensive evaluation of regulatory compliance obligations, and professional coordination with institutional decision-makers about development projects that required specialized knowledge of healthcare regulations, federal compliance requirements, and systematic coordination with regulatory agencies. Jennifer's systematic misinterpretation of my business involvement as cognitive confusion had prevented her from recognizing that my ongoing advisory role included comprehensive strategic planning, systematic financial analysis, and professional coordination activities that were essential to David's continued success and business expansion into complex development projects requiring specialized expertise and professional networking connections. The business development strategies that had enabled Thornfield Construction's expansion beyond traditional residential construction included systematic analysis of market opportunities, comprehensive evaluation of competitive positioning, and strategic coordination with professional advisors about business expansion, regulatory compliance, and systematic growth planning that had been guided by my expertise in complex organizational management and federal regulatory coordination. The professional mentorship that I had provided to David throughout his career development had included systematic education about business ethics, comprehensive training in professional relationship development, and ongoing guidance about strategic planning methodologies that had been essential for his success in building professional reputation, establishing strategic partnerships, and maintaining the ethical standards that had been central to our family's business success. Jennifer's assumption that my role in David's life was limited to traditional family dependency had prevented her from discovering the extensive professional coordination, business advisory activities, and strategic planning involvement that were central to Thornfield Construction's continued success and systematic wealth accumulation through careful business development and professional growth strategies. The systematic coordination that David and I maintained about business operations included regular strategic planning sessions, comprehensive financial analysis, detailed review of business performance, and ongoing coordination with professional advisors about business development, regulatory compliance, and systematic growth strategies that ensured continued success and family wealth accumulation through ethical business practices and strategic planning. The moment when I realized that Jennifer's systematic healthcare fraud was not just targeting my personal assets but was actually attacking the entire business partnership and professional advisory relationship that had been central to our family's success was when I discovered that her inheritance planning included systematic dismantling of the business advisory coordination that had been essential to Thornfield Construction's continued growth and David's professional development, revealing that her attempted murder was designed to destroy not just my life but the entire foundation of our family's business success and professional legacy. The cultural assumptions and systematic prejudices that would prove to be Jennifer Walsh's ultimate downfall began with her fundamental misunderstanding of what it meant to be a 72-year-old woman in American society, combined with her professional arrogance as a licensed nurse who assumed that medical credentials provided her with superior knowledge and authority over elderly patients, and her catastrophic underestimation of the generational differences between women who had built careers during the civil rights era versus those who had inherited professional opportunities without understanding the systematic barriers that had been overcome by previous generations. Jennifer's ageist assumptions about cognitive decline and medical dependency in elderly women had been reinforced by her professional experience as a hospital nurse, where she had observed genuine cases of dementia and age-related deterioration that created legitimate needs for family assistance and professional medical intervention. Her systematic application of these observations to my situation had prevented her from recognizing that her target was not a typical elderly patient, but a retired federal healthcare administrator whose professional background, analytical capabilities, and systematic expertise in healthcare fraud detection had been maintained and enhanced rather than diminished by advancing age and professional experience. The gender-based stereotypes that had guided Jennifer's assessment of my apparent vulnerabilities were rooted in traditional assumptions about women's financial capabilities, professional competence, and decision-making authority that had been systematically challenged and overcome during my generation's fight for professional equality and career advancement in male-dominated fields like healthcare administration and federal regulatory coordination. Her assumption that elderly women represented easy targets for financial manipulation and medical fraud demonstrated complete ignorance of the professional achievements and systematic expertise that had been accumulated by women who had spent decades breaking barriers and establishing themselves as recognized experts in complex professional fields. The systematic racism that had influenced Jennifer's evaluation of my family background and cultural characteristics had been based on stereotypical assumptions about Asian American family dynamics, generational authority structures, and traditional gender roles that failed to account for the educational achievements, professional success, and systematic cultural adaptation that had enabled immigrant families to establish themselves as leaders in American professional and business communities. Her assumption that cultural background would create deference to medical authority and family dependency had completely misread the systematic independence and professional confidence that had been central to my career success and personal development. The professional arrogance that had enabled Jennifer's confidence in her ability to manipulate and exploit what she perceived as a vulnerable elderly patient was based on her nursing credentials and hospital experience, which had created systematic overconfidence in her medical knowledge and authority, while preventing recognition that her target possessed superior expertise in healthcare administration, federal regulatory coordination, and systematic medical fraud detection that far exceeded her clinical nursing qualifications and professional experience in patient. The socioeconomic assumptions that had guided Jennifer's assessment of my apparent financial vulnerability were rooted in stereotypical beliefs about elderly women's financial knowledge, investment understanding, and systematic wealth management capabilities that failed to account for my decades of professional experience in healthcare administration budgeting, federal financial coordination, and systematic strategic planning that had been essential for managing multi-million-dollar healthcare budgets and complex financial coordination with federal agencies and professional advisors. The generational misunderstanding that had shaped Jennifer's approach to manipulating my apparent cognitive limitations was based on assumptions about technology adoption, information access, and systematic communication capabilities that failed to recognize that my generation of professional women had been pioneers in computer adoption, database management, and systematic information coordination that had been essential for federal regulatory coordination and comprehensive healthcare administration in complex organizational environments. The systematic ableism that had influenced Jennifer's evaluation of my apparent physical limitations and medical dependencies had prevented her from recognizing that my careful attention to health management, systematic medication coordination, and comprehensive medical planning represented professional expertise and systematic health maintenance rather than cognitive decline and medical vulnerability requiring external supervision and family intervention. The educational prejudice that had shaped Jennifer's assessment of my apparent intellectual limitations was based on assumptions about generational differences in formal education, professional training, and systematic expertise that failed to account for my advanced degrees from prestigious institutions, specialized federal training programs, and decades of continuing education in healthcare fraud detection and federal regulatory coordination that had maintained and enhanced my professional capabilities throughout my career and retirement. The technological assumptions that had enabled Jennifer's confidence in her ability to manipulate my apparent confusion about modern systems and procedures had prevented her from recognizing that my systematic approach to documentation, evidence collection, and professional coordination included sophisticated use of encrypted communication systems, federal database access, and comprehensive digital evidence management that exceeded her own technological capabilities and professional coordination requirements. The class-based prejudices that had influenced Jennifer's evaluation of my apparent social isolation and family dependency were rooted in assumptions about elderly women's social networks, professional relationships, and systematic community connections that failed to account for my ongoing coordination with federal agencies, professional associations, and systematic networking with healthcare fraud specialists who maintained active relationships and professional coordination that extended far beyond traditional family and community connections. The systematic intersection of multiple forms of prejudice and discrimination in Jennifer's assessment of my vulnerabilities had created a comprehensive misunderstanding of my actual capabilities, professional background, and systematic resources that was so complete and so fundamentally wrong that it guaranteed her detection and prosecution by the very person whose expertise and federal relationships would ensure maximum consequences for her systematic healthcare fraud and attempted murder. The moment when Jennifer's systematic prejudices and cultural assumptions collided with the reality of my professional background and federal coordination capabilities was when I activated the comprehensive federal investigation that would destroy every aspect of her life, career, and financial security through systematic application of healthcare fraud, prosecution protocols that I had personally developed, and federal relationships that I had maintained throughout my career in healthcare administration and fraud prevention. The single phone call that would initiate Jennifer's complete destruction was placed to FBI Special Agent Sarah Rodriguez, Healthcare Fraud Unit, whom I had personally trained in systematic healthcare fraud detection during her early career, and who maintained ongoing coordination with federal prosecutors specializing in elder abuse and medical crimes involving licensed healthcare professionals. The conversation lasted exactly 7 minutes and resulted in immediate activation of comprehensive federal investigation protocols that would expose Jennifer's systematic healthcare fraud and coordinate her prosecution through federal agencies that had been waiting for exactly this type of evidence. Sarah, this is Dr. Margaret Thornfield. I need to report systematic healthcare fraud and attempted murder by a licensed nurse who is currently conducting medication tampering and inheritance fraud coordination that matches federal investigation priorities for organized elder abuse networks. I have comprehensive evidence including documentation of systematic medication replacement, recorded conversations about medical fraud coordination, and systematic proof of premeditated attempted murder coordinated with inheritance theft that provides everything you need for federal prosecution. The federal response to my report was immediate and comprehensive. Within 4 hours, federal investigators had obtained warrants for comprehensive surveillance of Jennifer's activities, systematic monitoring of her communications, in coordination with hospital administration at Riverside General, for investigation of potential additional victims, and systematic review of suspicious patient outcomes that might indicate broader patterns of healthcare fraud and elder abuse involving licensed medical professionals. The systematic investigation that followed my report included comprehensive analysis of Jennifer's medication tampering methods, detailed review of her documentation about my apparent cognitive decline, systematic examination of her coordination with inheritance planning, and thorough investigation of her professional history for potential evidence of additional victims, and systematic patterns of healthcare fraud involving exploitation of elderly patients for financial gain. The evidence collection that had been systematically conducted during the 6 months of Jennifer's attempted murder included detailed photographs of replaced medications with laboratory analysis confirming systematic substitution of cardiac medications with inert placebos, comprehensive audio recordings of Jennifer's statements about my medical condition and inheritance planning, systematic documentation of her coordination with estate planning discussions, and thorough records of her systematic medical fraud and attempted murder that provided ironclad evidence for federal prosecution. The federal charges that were filed against Jennifer Walsh included attempted murder in the first degree with premeditation, systematic healthcare fraud involving a licensed medical professional, elder abuse with intent to commit inheritance fraud, conspiracy to commit murder for financial gain, systematic prescription drug violations involving medication tampering, professional licensing fraud through exploitation of nursing credentials, and federal racketeering charges connecting her crimes to organized elder abuse networks that had been under federal investigation. The asset forfeiture procedures that accompanied Jennifer's arrest included systematic seizure of all property connected to her criminal enterprise, comprehensive freezing of financial accounts and investment portfolios, immediate seizure of the house and luxury vehicles that had been purchased in anticipation of inheritance theft, and systematic recovery of all assets that could be connected to her attempted murder and systematic healthcare fraud activities. The professional consequences for Jennifer's nursing career included immediate suspension of her medical license pending federal prosecution, comprehensive investigation of all patients under her previous care for potential evidence of additional victims and systematic healthcare fraud, permanent revocation of all professional credentials and healthcare-related certifications, and systematic destruction of her professional reputation that would prevent any future employment in healthcare or related fields. The civil damages that would be recovered from Jennifer's criminal enterprise included comprehensive compensation for attempted murder, systematic medical fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and elder abuse that would result in judgment amounts exceeding any assets that Jennifer possessed or could accumulate during her lifetime, ensuring permanent financial destruction even beyond her federal prison sentence. The federal prosecution that followed resulted in Jennifer Walsh receiving a sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole for attempted murder and systematic healthcare fraud, with additional consecutive sentences for elder abuse, inheritance fraud, and professional licensing violations that would ensure she never again had the opportunity to exploit vulnerable elderly patients or commit systematic healthcare crimes. The broader investigation that was triggered by Jennifer's case resulted in comprehensive federal prosecution of organized elder abuse networks, systematic reform of healthcare fraud detection protocols, enhanced professional licensing oversight for medical professionals, and recovery of millions of dollars in fraudulent claims and illegal profits that had been generated through systematic exploitation of elderly patients by corrupt healthcare professionals. The educational impact of Jennifer's case extended to comprehensive training programs for healthcare professionals, law enforcement personnel, and elder abuse prevention specialists, who studied her criminal methodology and prosecution as a definitive example of federal response to systematic healthcare fraud, and the catastrophic consequences that awaited medical professionals who exploited their credentials to commit systematic crimes against vulnerable elderly patients. The systematic justice that was achieved through Jennifer's prosecution represented the culmination of decades of professional development, federal coordination, and systematic expertise in healthcare fraud detection that had been specifically designed to protect elderly patients from exactly the type of sophisticated medical manipulation and systematic exploitation that she had attempted against someone she assumed was just another helpless victim. The moment when Jennifer Walsh realized that her systematic healthcare fraud and attempted murder had been conducted against the worst possible target was when federal agents arrived at her hospital with arrest warrants, asset seizure orders, and comprehensive evidence of her systematic crimes that had been collected by the very person she had been trying to murder. Evidence that would ensure she spent the remainder of her life in federal prison rather than enjoying the comfortable inheritance she had been systematically planning to steal through my anticipated death. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.